So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Liberation and the Return to Life. For those who don't know me, my name is Heather Blumenthal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, and it is customary to present lectures or films on the Holocaust. Thus, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our partners, Rabbi Matthew Liebenberg of the Claremont Weinberg Shul and Rabbi David Shaw of the Sainton Shul and their congregants. Our guest speaker, Ephraim Kaye, is an old friend of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, and I had the pleasure of meeting him last year in December when he hosted a group of 19 educators from the Western Cape Education Department for a 10-day seminar at Yad Vashem. Ephraim Kaye has a BA and Masters in Modern Jewish History and the History of the Holocaust from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. From 1978 to 2000, he taught in the Israeli high school system, and during this time, he taught courses, on the Holocaust at several different colleges in Jerusalem. Since 1980, he has been involved in Holocaust research and education. In 1988, he joined the educational staff at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and since 1994, he has been the director of the international seminars at the International School for Holocaust Studies of Yad Vashem. During this time, he has coordinated and led over 450 international seminars from over 20 countries in 8 different languages. Over the past 30 years, he has led and guided more than 17 trips to Poland for high school students, graduates of the Yad Vashem seminars, and IDF officers. In 2015, he became the director for the Jewish World and International Seminars. He has organized international conferences on Holocaust education at the International School for Holocaust Studies of Yad Vashem. Ephraim has been a guest speaker and lecturer in different Holocaust centers and conferences throughout the world, and if I'm correct, on every continent. So before we start, housekeeping. Our team will switch off your cameras and everybody will be muted. Linda Heckner will be moderating our question and answer session at the end of the lecture. So be sure to type your questions either in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to Ephraim.
Yes, you putting me on the full screen now, Heather? Okay, you can hear me? Yes? First of all, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming from different places to this particular session that will deal with liberation. We are now commemorating 1,950 years to the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 by the Romans. I'm going to begin this session in a little bit different way than I originally planned. I'm going to begin it with a very well-known midrash that comes from the Talmud HaYerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. And it says there that when the temple was destroyed, the Messiah was born. What does that mean? That even in the depth of the destruction, the darkness, what looked hopeless, there was still hope. After everything the Jews had suffered more than 2,000 years ago. That idea will be an idea that will be a thread through this entire presentation that deals with a day of liberation where survivors found themselves. Sometimes they found themselves in camps, that day of liberation, by the Russians, the Americans, the British. They may have found themselves on a train, a convent, a monastery, in different camps. They were freed, but they were faced with two major questions that I'm going to try and unpack during this presentation. First of all, where do we go? Do we go home? Do we stay where we are? Do we look for new places to emigrate to? And the second, more important probably, was what do we do with our lives? For most of them, their families, their homes, their communities, the countries that they lived in, they were destroyed. Many had no family members whatsoever. How do you rebuild your life under those conditions? I'm going to the PowerPoint presentation now. And I hope we can all see this. Where you see I wrote liberation with a question mark. In order to understand where I'm taking you during this presentation about liberation, about survivors, and the two questions I posed, where do they go and what do they do with their lives? We have to understand the context of World War II and the casualties in general. I just want you to look at this graph I put up. It's estimated today by different Holocaust and World War II historians that between 40 and 60 million people lost their lives in both the European theater of operations and the Pacific theater of operations. Most of the death and destruction was concentrated in the European theater of operations. It's estimated of the 40 to 60 million people that were killed, and between 20 and 30 million were civilians and soldiers of the former USSR. This was a total war that encompassed tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. And it affected every single one of them in very, very different ways. The Jewish population, a few words about this before the Holocaust itself. We're talking about 9.5 million Jews living throughout Europe before World War II, about another 1 million to 1.5 million living throughout North Africa and the Middle East. So we're talking about 11 million Jews living throughout Europe and North Africa and the Middle East before World War II. The number of Jews that lost their lives. You have the number, the absolute number of Jews that were killed in each particular country and how the percentage of the number of Jews that were living in that country before the war that lost their lives. And we're talking anywhere between 5.8 to 6 million plus minus Jews that were murdered during the years of 1933 to 1945, the years of the Holocaust. In order to understand what Victory Day meant, in Europe, the 8th of May, 1945, by the way, for the Russians, it was the 9th of May. I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm going to bring you a very short film that we show in our historical museum at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. There's no narrative. You're going to see just a few minutes of what did that day look like in different countries throughout Europe. So let's look at this and listen to this together. Those are the Americans, the Soviets meeting in the Elbe in May 1945. The British Americans. What we just saw, the actual photographs of the day of liberation. Not the day of liberation, excuse me, the day that World War II ended on the European continent. I want you to just think about what you just saw, the tremendous outpouring of joy, 6 long years of war, from September 1939 to May 1945, the tremendous sacrifices that every country made, the ticker tape parade in the United States, in New York City. You saw pictures of Churchill, General Montgomery, American and Russian troops meeting on the Elbe in May 1945. And in France, de Gaulle, at the end of the picture, the end of the clip you saw, Joseph Stalin there in Moscow. Everybody could breathe a breath of fresh air. They could go home to their families and rejoice. I want you to see now a different picture altogether. And in our museum, we take you from this particular room that shows you this film to the next room, which the film I'm about to show you is the liberation of the camps, what the Allies found in different camps. It has no narrative to it. I'm going to show you just a very short clip. It's only 2 minutes long. I want you to see these photographs and film. I purposely was very quiet while watching that piece of footage. This is what we show at Yad Vashem. It's a very large room where you see pictures that were taken by the Allies when they found these different camps, Bergen, Belson, Dachau, Buchenwald. When you look at these people, you have to ask yourself, where do you go from here? How do you rebuild lives that are totally destroyed? And I want to apologize personally to anyone watching that footage that have family members that experienced these horrific events during the Holocaust and that survived. I know that most of these survivors had guilt feelings. Why did I survive? Why me? Why not somebody else? Seeing the previous pictures of the tremendous joy and jubilation of the Allies and their victory over Nazi Germany and their collaborating countries, and then seeing these pictures creates this dissonance where it is difficult for us to ever understand what they went through. I'm going to show you a piece. This person over here out in Moskin, it's a very short piece, but I thought it was very significant as well to try and understand what the Allies met, what they saw, the people they come in contact with, and their immediate raw feelings. Let's hear his very short testimony as a person that found one of these camps in May 1945.
I remember when I was outside seeing this elderly gentleman come up to me, and he went down on the ground, and he started to kiss my boots. My boots were filled with blood and feces and mud. And I knew he meant well. He was trying to be affectionate to me. He was saying, "Danke," and he was kissing my boots, but it made me very uncomfortable. And I remember picking him up under the armpits and bringing him up toward me. And as I did, as his head came up, I looked at the back of the nape of his neck and down his back. And oh my God, there were these open, pussy, festering sores. And out of the sores, the lice, they all had lice because the camps were filthy. So the lice were crawling out of these sores. And it smelled out. And God, I don't know how God gave me the strength not to back off. He smelled from high heaven. But I somehow had the strength to hold my ground. And he came up and I embraced him. And he started to kiss me and say, "Danke, danke, Americana, Juda, American, Jew, Juda, Juda, Americana." And he was crying, and then I started to cry, and there was a lot of crying going on, and I'm not embarrassed to tell you this was very emotional.
This is just one testimony of many testimonies we have of Allied soldiers, British and American, that this is what they encountered in April and May 1945. And ladies and gentlemen, they were traumatized. For many, the sights that they encountered in these different camps were worse than anything they had seen in battle. From Normandy, June 1944, up until April, May 1945. Their encounter with these camps literally traumatized them. Many never spoke about it with their families. It was something they experienced and put it away and tried to forget about it. And the question here now is, where do these people go? What happens to the hundreds of thousands? The map I'm showing you here gives you the different displaced persons camps. It's estimated that when the war was over, there were more than 10 million displaced persons from all over Europe. There were those from Russian POWs. They didn't really want to go home to the Soviet Union, or from other countries, Hungary, Poland. Most of them went home to their host countries. But for the Jews, where do they go? Knowing that they have no place to return to. And so throughout Austria and Germany, you had a number of displaced persons camps where these hundreds of thousands of Jews were housed. The camps only closed down in 1952, but the idea was to give them a place to recuperate. The Allies wanted them to go home. They weren't willing to go back to their host countries, knowing there was only anti-Semitism there. And they wanted to immigrate. And essentially, of about 300,000 Jewish displaced persons, these are the numbers and the places where they immigrated to. To Israel, specifically after 1948, Israel, the doors were totally open. More than half of the survivors that we know came to the state of Israel, about 100,000 to the United States. And I purposely put Australia about 27,000. Interesting enough, the Australian government, the Americans did not open their doors very quickly when the war was over for refugees from anywhere. Australia was very interesting in that during World War II, they realized their population only numbered 6-7 million during World War II. They needed more people. And they actually opened up their doors and allowed refugees to immigrate to Australia when the war was over. And about 27,000 Holocaust survivors made their way to Australia, which, interesting enough, was a very high proportion of the number of Jews living there in general. And Australia today has one of the highest proportional populations of Holocaust survivors throughout the world. Towards the end of our museum at Yad Vashem, there's an area we call a return to life, the return to life. And we have a quote there as you walk into that room: liberated, but not free. That is a paradox of the Jew. And essentially, as I mentioned before, they were faced with these two major dilemmas. Where do we go? And what do we do? Before I go into that, I want to mention something here. That probably one of the miracles of this entire story is that most of the Holocaust survivors had the strength to go forward. Not everyone, I'm making a generalization, but most Holocaust survivors had the strength to pick up and to go on. The real revenge that survivors took at the end of the war, and I'm using revenge here in a very different context than what you may be all thinking, the real revenge that survivors took was to get married. That was the revenge that survivors took. In Bergen, Belson, we know today that a year, 1946, after the camp was liberated by the British, they celebrated the 1,000th Jewish wedding, getting married, going forward, and then having children. Yes, that was their revenge. Not just getting married, but having kindle, having children. But I want to say something else here as well. That the ultimate revenge of Holocaust survivors was having grandchildren. When the grandchildren came, I think that many Holocaust survivors felt that they had completed their mission. They could rest. Hitler had destroyed their families. The children that grew up in survivor homes had a very small nucleus of a family. They had no grandparents, no aunts and uncles. But once the grandchildren came, and by the way, many times survivors never told their own children what they experienced. They wanted to be normal, not traumatized as they had been traumatized during the war. When grandchildren came, and sometimes a grandchild would come to Bobby, to Zadie, say, "What's that number on your arm?" And they were capable of telling their grandchildren. So the real revenge was having grandchildren. Where do we go? I'm going to show you a very short clip from a Holocaust survivor. And the survivors I'm about to show you, in answering the two questions I have posed here, where do we go and what do we do, are all survivors that come to our Yad Vashem educational seminars. They talk to teachers from all over the world. They talk to students. They talk to IDF soldiers. These are people that are willing to share their experiences with people from all over the world. Freida, she's now 99 years old. She's going to celebrate her 100th birthday in March. She was born in Warsaw. She experienced the Warsaw Ghetto, survived the ghetto experience. She survived the April 1943 revolt of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. In May 1943, she and her sister and other Jews, tens of thousands that were found in bunkers, were taken to Majdanek death camp. Her and her sister survived the Majdanek death camp. They were sent from there to Auschwitz, from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück. And on April 15th, 1945, she and her sister were liberated by the British Army at Bergen, Belson. On December 18th, 1945, she and Romak, who became her husband, had one of the first Jewish weddings at Bergen, Belson. Let's listen to her testimony and how she tells the story.
So one afternoon, there was a table, a long table, about 5-6 men came to have company, my company, everybody was there. The Roma came in. He looked not from Auschwitz, not from, he was then already 30, 31 years old, but he was handsome, very handsome. And it is a suit, not an outfit fashion. Okay, so since then he was a part of this whole crowd. But he wasn't bashful, he didn't take too long. And he right away told me openly so that he would like to marry me. And it was the day of the wedding. And I was crying and crying. I didn't have even a prom dress to put on to this wedding, but this didn't matter. And everybody was invited. Whoever wants to come. There was no invitations, no music. The music, luckily, one of our friends, Joseph Mark, they found the accordion, and he was really, he was making happy people. He was playing beautiful on the accordion. His wife was a pianist, but we didn't have a piano. He played Jewish music. And at the wedding, there were two rabbis married us off. Rav Helfgott, who was the English army Rav, and a Ralph who, I got his name, he was a survivor. So, you see, I brought you one diktuba, the saw diktuba, very original. Many people saw already the very original knupa with two rabbis, with two witnesses. When I met him and he asked me to marry, so I saw his eyes, beautiful eyes, but very sad. And inside me, I said, I thought that I didn't answer right away. You know the story, this and that. But I decided to bring life to his eyes. This was very important to me, and I did.
That's Freida. She wanted to bring life to his sad eyes. Freida and her sister had lost their family. Romek was the only survivor of his entire family. And this is what many survivors did, to find someone, to come together, to connect. Both Freida and Romek came to Israel with the creation of the State of Israel, joined the Haganah, they fought here. Her sister apparently made her way to the United States. In the late 1950s, her sister begged her to come to join her. She needed her. She couldn't say no to her sister. They left, joined her sister in the United States. And only 15 years later did Romek and Freida come back to Israel. And their son and daughter, that had grown up in the United States, went to school there. They remained there. They have 2 children. They have a number of grandchildren. She has great grandchildren. Her husband passed away about 10 years ago. But this is an example of a person with everything she suffered, everything she experienced. She wanted to make her husband happy, give him some joy. Now her name, by the way, in Yiddish, Freida, means happiness. So there must be something in the name. I'm going to take you to a different story. This is Judith Kleinemann from Italy. She was only 5 years old, 6 years old, when in Firenze, she was Milano, and in Firenze, her father passed away in the early years of the war, just her mother and her grandmother. And in 1944, they were ordered, her mother and her grandmother and herself, to come to the office of the Gestapo there in Milano. She was a small child, didn't understand what was happening. They were brought there. An SS officer stood there, and she saw her mother, her grandmother, and a Christian neighbor sitting on a bench. And the German officer turns to her and says to her, "What's your name?" She told him, "Judita." And he asks her, "Judita, whom do you want to go with?" And she didn't understand the question. "What do you mean, who do I want to go with?" "Of course I want to go with my mother." But she looked at her mother, and her mother, realizing what was happening, put on a very blank face, sending a very clear message to her 5-year-old daughter: "Don't choose me." And she understood. She didn't choose her grandmother. She said in different testimonies that her grandmother sometimes would hit her, so she didn't choose her grandmother. She chose the Christian neighbor. When the Germans came to take away the grandmother, And then the mother, as the Nazi, the SS officer, was taking her mother, she cried out to her. Her mother couldn't answer her. She didn't understand what was happening. The Christian neighbor took her, told her that she couldn't provide for her, but took her to a convent where they were willing to hide her and take care of her. And the Mother Superior told her, Judita, you're the only Jewish child here. You can't tell anybody that you're Jewish. And she kept the secret. A year later, when the war was over, 1945, two people come to the convent. They were looking for Jewish children that had been hidden, Leah and Tzvika. And the Mother Superior told them there's a Jewish child here. And they want to meet her. She was called down to meet with them. She thought maybe her parents had come to pick her up. She was very excited. When she found two people, she didn't know who they were. She didn't know what to think. But they told her that they want to take her and bring her to the land of the Jews. Let's listen to what she says in this encounter.
Told you that she won't go with you. And they said, you did. You're not a Christian. So you have to be and live with the people that you belong to. And the Mother Superior said, Dita, you are very dear to me. I don't want you to go. Jesus saved you. Under his protection, you're safe. And Leah said, she doesn't belong to you. She was only put in your custody. And Leah came to me and she kneeled down and looked me straight in the eyes and said, you did. You're 7 years old. You're a big girl already. So you have to understand, here in the convent, you found a temporary shelter. Now that the war is over, we are going to all the convents and taking out all the Jewish children and bringing them to Eretz Israel. Your place is not here in Italy, it's there in Eretz Israel. Mother Superior said to me, Dita, you have to make a very difficult decision. Go to the little room and think over where you want to be. After half an hour, we will call you and you will tell us what you have decided. I went upstairs and I was very confused. I didn't know what to do. On the one hand, I was used to being in the convent. I was there a year and a half already. I had 4 girls that were good friends of mine. I had 2 nuns that liked me and Mother Superior that loved me. And then I said to myself, Leah said that all the Jews are going now to Eretz Israel. That means that my mother and grandmother are also there. Yes, I will go with it.
And what happens? She goes with Tzvika and Leah. They take her to a place called Salvino in northern Italy, where other Jewish children, orphans, were collected by the members of the Jewish Agency. And eventually, she made her way to the land of Israel. She was put on a boat, one of the illegal ships that brought immigrants to the land of Israel. She was put in Ben Shemen on a youth village where she continued her education, went into the army, became a teacher in one of our northern communities, Kiryat Shmona. This is in the 1950s. Married, has children, grandchildren, and Judith continues to tell her story of where she was saved, who saved her, and how she returned to life here in the state of Israel.
Told you that.
I'm going to show you another scene over here that you all probably recognize. Again, the Day of Liberation was in different places. for different people. This is Brignitz. It's May 8th, May 9th, 1945. The Russian soldier that comes in on his horse and liberates the Schindler Jews. Let's look at this just for a minute.
Have you been in Poland? I just came from Poland. Are there any Jews left? Where should we go? Don't go east. That's what they hit you there. I wouldn't go west either if I were you. We could use some food. Isn't that a town over there?
Essentially, what happens to the 1,200 Schindler Jews when they were liberated by that Russian officer in May 9th, 1945, they all went back to Krakow. It took them weeks. The train system wasn't working properly, but the overwhelming majority went back to where they actually came from Krakow, and tried to rebuild their lives, find their businesses, homes, and continue their lives there in Krakow. I'm going to introduce you to two people, very, very special people, Nachum and Genya Manor. They were both born in Krakow. And they were both in Schindler's factory, in the Mile factory. Nachum was an auto mechanic. Genya worked on the lathes that produced the pots and pans for the Germans. And that's where they fell in love. And Nachum proposed to marry Genya if they survive. And he proposed to marry her in a small town outside of Tel Aviv called Givatayim. And why there of all places? Nachum's family was a Zionist family. In the 1920s, over 80,000 Polish Jews made their way from Poland to the British Mandate of Palestine. Nachum, his father and mother, him, his brother and sister, settled in a small town outside of Tel Aviv called Givatayim. That's where his first years, where he grew up there. 1932, the economic depression, as a result of the stock market in the United States, the economic depression, he had no work. He apparently still had a business in Krakow, and he took his family back to Poland. Most Jews that found safe haven outside of Poland or Germany never went back there. His family, it was 1932, 31, 32, decided to go back. His father and mother, brother and sister were all murdered at death camp Belson, where most of the Krakowian Jewry perished in 1942. As you saw in the film, May 1945, they go back to Krakow. Genya's mother and brother were both survived by Oskar Schindler. He saved sometimes entire families. Genya stays there. Nachum doesn't stay very long in Krakow. He couldn't find any members of his family that were alive. Decides he has to get to the land of Israel and makes his way to Italy, boards one of the ships, illegal ships that brings him to the land of Israel, joins the Jewish underground, becomes a wireless operator on one of the ships that ferries back and forth illegal immigrants to the land of Israel. They didn't see each other for 4 years. Only in December of 1949, Genya made her way not to the British mandate of Palestine, but to the state of Israel. And January 17th, 1950, Nachum and Genya were married in a small town outside of Tel Aviv called Givatayim. I want you to hear part of their testimony in the story that they tell.
ב-9 במאי, שינדלר אסף את כולנו בתוך אולם של המפעל, ואמר, גרמניה הפסידה במלחמה, אתם אנשים חופשיים, אתם חוזרים הביתה. ואמר, אני מוכרח לברוח, אני משאיר אתכם, ותתחילו את החיים שלכם בתור בני אדם חופשיים, והוא באמת עזב אותנו ואנחנו נסענו לפולין. המוסיקה ראשונה, קיבלתי מנחם. זה היה ביום הולדת שלי, 1945, שנגמרה המלחמה, היינו בבריניץ שנינו, עלינו, היה שם יער קטן על הגבעה, עלינו על הגבעה, ושם בפעם ראשונה הוא קיבג אותי ונתן לי נשיקה.
As I said, this is only part of their story, their love story. On January 17th, the year 2000, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. And Nachum and Genya decided to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary at the most appropriate and significant place for them anywhere in the world. Schindler's gravesite, which is on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. We had then an educational seminar for educators from Australia that was going on in January of the year 2000. We went up to the Schindler's grave at Mount Zion together with these educators. And for the first time, Nachum and Genya brought their son, their daughter, and their 4 grandchildren. It was the first time I'd seen the entire family. And it was there, for the first time, that I realized that that ring that they gave Oskar Schindler before he departed from them on May 8th, on May 9th, 1945, they gave him that very famous ring. It was a real story. And the survivors inscribed inside that ring, one who saves a single life as if he saved an entire world. And they gave it to him as a present. They wrote it in Hebrew. And I saw there on Mount Zion, near Schindler's grave, that wasn't just a verse from the Talmud. That was reality. Oskar Schindler saved not just 1,200 Jews, but countless future generations. Today it's estimated that there's more than 15,000 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren that of the offspring of the original 1,200 that he saved. And I want you to see this picture. Here's a picture we took of Nachum and Genya about 10 years ago. He's now 96 years old. She's 93. And we had a celebration for them at the hotel where they met with educators and telling their story. And this picture over here, if you look very carefully, I'm putting the cursor. This is a ring that Nachum gave Genya. He inscribed her initials GW, Genya Wohlfeiler. He fashioned that ring in Schindler's factory out of the metal he could find and gave it to her as a birthday present on her 18th birthday there in Schindler's factory. Ladies and gentlemen, she has never, ever taken that ring off her finger. Even when she arrived at Auschwitz with the other women, they were diverted. Instead of going to Brinnlitz, they ended up in Auschwitz, and then later on they were taken to Brinnlitz. And the SS beat her to take off that ring, and she refused to take it off. That symbol of their love and commitment is in this one picture. This is the only photograph they have, ladies and gentlemen, of their day after their wedding. They don't have any wedding pictures. January 18th, 1950, the day after their wedding, they're on the kibbutz, Nachum and Genya. And this last picture I want to show you is their granddaughter and their great-grandson. This is about 7 or 8 years ago. I get an email from Nachum. Ephraim, we deserve a Mazal Tov. Our first great-grandson was just born. I immediately wrote back to him, wonderful news, Mazal Tov, did you tell Oscar Schindler? And I get an immediate response from Nachum, he was the first to know. This is who Oscar Schindler was for these survivors. And if there's any real ultimate revenge, it's having those great-grandchildren. The last survivor and his story I'm going to take you through today, this morning, is a person named Tibi Ram, originally from Slovakia, Hungary. His brother, his father, was sent to Auschwitz, May, June 1944. They were only there for a few weeks. They were transferred to a different camp, and they worked there. At the end of the day, they were liberated at Bergen, Belson. Let's hear part of his story and where he was liberated from and his feelings.
ברגן בלזן זה היה המקום שאם יש גיהנום זה המקום. אבא שוכב מצב חמור מאוד, וכשאני מבחין שאבא כבר לא נושם יותר, לוקח את האח שלי, מתחיל ללכת איתו, כי מכיוון מסוים באים אנשים והם אומרים שהאנגלים הגיעו ואנחנו חופשים. בדרך אנחנו פוגשים שתי בנות מהשכבה של האח שלי, הן מזהות אותנו ואומרות, אמא שלכם פה. בדיוק שנה אחרי שהופרדנו מאמא, הם מביאים לנו את אמא. אני מאוד שמחתי שפגשתי את אמא, אבל אני חשבתי האם היא שמחה כשאנחנו מודיעים לה שאבא מת והיא רואה שהבן הגדול שלה הולך למות, וגם הקטן הוא לא מי יודע מה הגיבור, אז אני לא יודע אם היא כל כך שמחה. זאת הייתה פגישה עצובה. מכניסים אותי לבית חולים, אולם גדול, 2 שורות של מיטות, אני בשורה אחת, האח שלי שורה לפניי. אני נרדם, אני מתעורר אחרי לא יודע כמה זמן, אני רואה שהמיטה של אח שלי ריקה. אני יורד, מדדה, שואל, מירה, אף אחד, כולם מוזמנים, כולם חסים איתי, אף אחד לא יודע שום דבר, עד שניגש אליי אחד, דווקא לבוש יפה, נראה טוב, וילד בו איתי מכניס אותי למשרד שלו, הוא מציג את עצמו, הוא רופא יהודי פולני, אומר לי, תשמע, האח שלך לא החזיק מעמד והוא מת הבוקר. והוא פורץ בבכי. אני כלום, אין רגשות, אני אומר לו, תודה רבה, ואני הולך, כי אני צריך לחפש את אמא. מסתובב במחנה, לא מצליח להשיג שום מידע על אמא. זאת הייתה פעם האחרונה שראיתי את אמא. הגעתי לארץ באפריל 48, אז ברור שעשיתי קיבוץ, היינו קבוצה שלמה מיועדים
Okay, I stopped his story over here. I'm going to show you another part of his story, but as he mentions here, he went to a kibbutz Afikim, which is just south of the Sea of Galilee, and that's where he spent, to this day, most of his life, on kibbutz Afikim. He realized one thing. After losing his father a few days before the liberation of the camp, then his brother after liberation, his mother as well, that you have to have a homeland. And building a homeland for the Jews, this became his objective. Coming to that homeland, protecting it, and being part and parcel of rebuilding and helping to build that land. Let's listen to the last part of his testimony. Tibi.
אז אני התחתנו ב-1955, כשאני הפכתי להיות אבא הייתי מאושר. מאוד אהבתי את הבת הגדולה שלי, אחר כך את הבן, את הבת הקטנה. אבל מה שמעניין, בכל הלידות אני הייתי במילואים. אף פעם לא הייתי נוכח בלידות. אני השתתפתי בכל מלחמות ישראל, תמיד ביחידות שדה, ביחידות חי"ר, חוץ מצוק איתן. הייתי כבר בן 80 ומשהו, והתביישתי לבקש, כי ידעו שלא ייתנו לי. אני 35 שנה לא דיברתי, האמת גם לא חשבתי על השואה, אבל לא הזכרתי את השואה. אני אף פעם לא חשבתי חזרה מה עם אבא שלי, מה עם אמא שלי. אני חשבתי רק על קדימה, קדימה. אני תמיד חושב קדימה. פעם לא רציתי להיות יהודי, והיום חשובה לי המשכיות העם היהודי. בשבילי חשובה כברת ארץ שהיא שלי, של היהודים. אבא שלי אמר לי שהדבר הכי חשוב שיש לבן אדם זה מולדת. ועל המולדת צריך לשמור.
Now we're coming to the end of this presentation. A few more words about Tibi. He served in the Israeli military for more than 20 years, reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. One of the stills that you saw there in his uniform, he actually received a citation from the President of the State of Israel that from 1948, the War of Independence, until 2010, he served in every single Israeli conflict and volunteered for more than 20 years to come, to help, to advise, to motivate soldiers over the last 20 years. This is Tibi Ram. And I want to end with something else about Tibi. His friends on Kibbutz Afikim would say to him, Tibi, why are you going to Yad Vashem all the time? It's a cemetery. It's death. Why are you going there all the time? And I have to tell you that whenever we had a group and we needed somebody, an army group of educators, whoever it may be, I called Tibi. I'm on my way. It's 2.5 hours from his kibbutz to get to Jerusalem. He's on his way by bicycle, by bus, by taxi. He'll get there. This is Tibi. And he'd say to his friends on the kibbutz, when I walk into Yad Vashem, I go through that main gate. I see soldiers. I see young people. I see educators from all over the world. It fills me with life. A machaya. Gives me strength. That's what going to Yad Vashem means to me. And I hope on this solemn day, where I began the conversation, that during the destruction of the temple, the Messiah was born, that hope was born. What you've heard and seen today is in the darkest days of our history, only 70 years ago, hope was born as well. And people went forward and created and continue to create and to contribute to this state. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you for listening.